The war in Europe was already ending when Joseph Stalin began to feel uneasy. Hitler was finished. Berlin was rubble. The Nazi armies that had once thundered across Europe were now broken columns of prisoners, trudging east and west under foreign guards. To most of the world, peace had arrived. But to Stalin, a new threat was rising, one that did not speak German, did not wear a swastika, and did not shout in rage-filled speeches. It wore a polished helmet. It carried pearl-handled pistols, and it moved faster than any army in history. Its name was George S. Patton. The man Stalin could not predict. Stalin had built his power on one simple rule: know your enemy better than he knows himself. Brutal, emotional, easy to manipulate once his pride was wounded. Stalin's spies had mapped every weakness in the German dictator, every paranoia, every blind spot. But Patton was something else. The Soviet intelligence reports described him with a strange mix of fear and confusion, aggressive beyond doctrine, independent of political control, obsessive hatred of communism, commands loyalty bordering on worship. This terrified Stalin, because Patton did not behave like a politician. He did not behave like a diplomat. He behaved like a warrior who believed the war was not over. The first warning as American tanks raced across France in 1944, Soviet analysts began to notice something disturbing. Patton was not just defeating Germans. He was studying Europe. His armored columns did not move randomly. They seized bridges, rail hubs, fuel depots, and cities that had no immediate tactical value against the retreating Wehrmacht, but enormous value in a future war. Patton was mapping a battlefield that did not yet exist. And Stalin realized something horrifying. Patton was already thinking about the next enemy. Patton's dangerous words. Unlike most Allied generals, Patton did not hide his thoughts. In meetings, in letters, in conversations with reporters, he said the same thing again and again: "We're fighting the wrong enemy. The Soviets will be our problem." These words reached Moscow faster than bullets. Stalin's spies in Washington and London sent transcripts, intercepted conversations, even private letters. Every time Patton spoke about Russia, it went straight to the Kremlin, and every time Stalin grew more afraid. Not because Patton was powerful, but because Patton wanted a fight. On paper, the Soviet Union had the largest army in the world, but Stalin knew the truth. The Red Army was exhausted. It had lost more than 20 million people. Entire generations were gone. Cities were empty of men. Tanks were worn out. Supplies were stretched thin. Patton's army was the opposite. Fresh, well-fed, mechanized, fueled by American industry, and commanded by a man who treated speed like a weapon. If war came between East and West, Stalin knew Patton would not fight it like Hitler. Patton would strike fast, deep, relentless. As Berlin fell to Soviet forces, Patton was already racing toward Czechoslovakia. He wanted Prague, not for glory, but for position. Every mile Patton advanced before Soviet troops arrived meant territory that would not fall behind the Iron Curtain. Stalin noticed. Soviet commanders began receiving frantic orders. Advance faster. Reach Prague before the Americans. This was no longer about Germany. It was about who would control Europe. And Patton was winning the race. When Patton's tanks reached western Czechoslovakia, they stood just days away from colliding with the Red Army. American soldiers could see Soviet units across the lines. Two armies. Two ideologies. One spark away from war. Stalin believed Patton wanted that spark. And he was right. Patton openly told his officers that the United States should turn around and drive east while the Red Army was still disorganized. We can defeat them now. Later, it will be impossible. To Stalin, this was a nightmare. Patton wasn't afraid of the Soviet Union. He was eager to destroy it. Hitler had been a madman. Patton was a strategist. Hitler ruled through fear. Patton ruled through speed and discipline. Hitler destroyed his own army with bad decisions. Patton listened to his battlefield commanders and trusted his instincts. Most terrifying of all, Patton had the industrial power of America behind him. Factories, fuel, planes, tanks, food, everything the Soviet Union lacked. If Patton had convinced Washington to continue the war eastward, Stalin knew the Red Army might not survive. Stalin could not defeat Patton in battle, so he did what he always did. He worked in the shadows. Soviet agents in Washington quietly spread stories about Patton's behavior, his temper, his controversial remarks, his unreliability. Soon, Patton was removed from command, not defeated, not dishonored, just sidelined. The greatest battlefield commander in Europe was taken out of the game, and Stalin could finally breathe again. Months later, Patton was dead. A strange car accident, a sudden injury, a quick decline. The man who had terrified Stalin more than Hitler was gone, and with him went the last chance of stopping Soviet domination of Eastern Europe by force. The Cold War would come, but not with tanks, not with Patton, because Stalin had survived the one general who might have crushed him. The silence that followed Patton's removal was louder than any artillery barrage he had ever commanded. In Washington, men in clean suits congratulated themselves. The war was over. Europe was rebuilding. There was no need for another conflict. But thousands of miles away, in the ruins of Eastern Europe, Joseph Stalin was still watching the western horizon, waiting for the thunder of Patton's tanks that never came. Yet even without Patton on the battlefield, his shadow haunted the Kremlin. Every Soviet general knew the name. Every political officer whispered it. The Americans might be smiling now, shaking hands and exchanging medals, but Stalin believed something far more dangerous lay beneath those smiles. Patton had spoken a truth that others feared to admit. The war had only changed enemies, and Stalin knew that truth had not died with Patton. Soviet intelligence continued to monitor every American armored unit in Europe, every rail shipment, every movement of troops. Even after Germany surrendered, the United States kept enormous forces stationed across Western Europe. Tanks sat fueled. Airfields buzzed with activity. Supply depots were overflowing. These were not the actions of a nation demobilizing. These were the actions of a nation preparing. Stalin saw the fingerprints of Patton everywhere. Even without command, Patton's ideas lived on in the men who had served under him. Officers who had raced across France, tank commanders who had smashed through German lines, logistics chiefs who had learned how to feed an army moving faster than any in history. They were ready. And Stalin feared that one day, someone in Washington would realize what Patton had already known, that the Soviet Union was not an ally, it was a rival. The Soviet grip on Eastern Europe tightened with every passing month. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, governments were quietly replaced, elections controlled, opponents vanished. The Iron Curtain was lowering, just as Patton had warned. In secret briefings, Stalin studied maps of Europe late into the night. He marked American airfields, British ports, French highways. He imagined arrows on the map pushing east. The arrows always led to Moscow. He had defeated Napoleon. He had defeated Hitler, but Patton would not come slowly. Patton would come like a lightning strike. The paranoia grew. Soviet troops were ordered to dig in along the Elbe. Bridges were prepared for demolition. Air defense units ringed every major city. Officially, these were precautions. Unofficially, they were defenses against Patton's ghost. In Washington, General George C. Marshall and President Truman debated the future. They saw a tired nation. Soldiers wanted to go home. The public wanted peace. But intelligence reports from Europe told a darker story. Soviet forces were not withdrawing. They were consolidating. They were fortifying. They were preparing for something. The fear Patton had planted now spread quietly through the Pentagon. Some of the very men who had once thought him reckless now began to wonder if he had been right. And somewhere in Germany, George S. Patton watched it all from the sidelines. He had been stripped of command, assigned to minor administrative duties far from the front lines. To him, it felt like prison. He was not a man made for desks. He was made for war. His private letters became darker, bitter, frustrated. "They are letting the Russians take everything," he wrote. "We could stop them, but they won't let us." Patton knew something terrible was coming. Stalin knew it too. Both men waited. The difference was that Stalin had the power to act. Patton did not. Soviet propaganda began painting America as the next enemy. Films, newspapers, and speeches portrayed the West as capitalist exploiters who would soon try to crush socialism. Behind closed doors, Stalin ordered the rapid expansion of tank factories and airfields. The war machine that had defeated Hitler was not shutting down. It was turning west. Stalin never forgot that Patton had wanted to strike first, and that made Patton the most dangerous man alive. Even after his removal, Stalin refused to believe the threat was gone. He suspected that Patton was being held in reserve like a weapon hidden behind a curtain, waiting. Every time American diplomats made a demand, Stalin saw Patton behind their words. Every time Western leaders protested Soviet actions, Stalin imagined Patton's tanks revving their engines. It was Patton's doctrine that haunted him: speed, shock, relentless attack. The very things that had shattered Germany could shatter the Soviet Union, and Stalin knew the Red Army, exhausted and bled white, might not survive another war. The fear began to influence his decisions. He tightened control even further. He purged officers he suspected might sympathize with the West. He rushed to build nuclear weapons. He sealed borders. A terrified empire does not relax, it fortifies. In December 1945, Patton's car slid on an icy road. The crash was not dramatic. No explosion. No fire, just twisted metal and broken bones. Within days, the greatest battlefield commander in Europe was dead. The official story was simple: an accident. But in Moscow, Stalin allowed himself a rare moment of relief. The man who had wanted to march on the Red Army was gone, or so he thought. Patton's death did not end the idea. It only buried the man. Within a few years, the Cold War began. NATO was formed. The Warsaw Pact answered. Tanks faced tanks across a divided Germany. And Stalin knew in his bones that this was the war Patton had predicted. The war of nerves. The war of power. The war without mercy. Stalin lived just long enough to see it take shape. When he died in 1953, the armies he had feared were still there, just beyond the horizon, waiting. And somewhere in history, the shadow of George S. Patton still loomed, the general who never got his final war, but scared the most ruthless dictator on earth more than Hitler ever did. After Stalin's death, the world breathed, but the fear he had lived with did not die. The Soviet Union did not suddenly become less afraid of the West. The paranoia, the preparations, the vast armored divisions parked across Eastern Europe, all of it remained. It was as if the Kremlin still expected Patton to come crashing through the Iron Curtain at any moment. The men who replaced Stalin had been trained under him. They had listened as he warned them about the Americans. They had seen how nervous he became whenever Patton's name was mentioned. Even though the general was gone, his reputation still moved armies. In the ruins of Germany, NATO and the Warsaw Pact stared at each other across minefields and barbed wire. Soldiers on both sides could see their enemies through binoculars. Tank barrels were always pointed west or east, never lowered. The world was not at peace. It was frozen. American commanders who had served under Patton quietly passed on his philosophy to a new generation of officers. Move fast, hit hard, never give the enemy time to breathe. If war comes, strike first. These ideas became doctrine. In Moscow, intelligence reports continued to describe American armored drills that looked eerily familiar. The same deep penetration tactics, the same emphasis on speed and surprise, the same obsession with breaking enemy lines before they could react. It was Patton's ghost training an army that no longer had him. Soviet generals knew their army could not match that kind of mobility. They had numbers, they had courage, but they did not have the logistical machine that could keep tanks and aircraft moving nonstop for weeks. That terrified them more than any nuclear bomb. So the Soviet response was simple: build more. More tanks, more artillery, more soldiers. If they could not match American speed, they would drown it in steel. Eastern Europe became a fortress. Railways were reinforced to carry heavy armor. Bridges were widened. Roads were rebuilt not for civilians, but for tanks. Everything was done with one enemy in mind: the Americans. And behind that fear was Patton. Across the Atlantic, the United States tested atomic weapons, one blast after another. Mushrooms of fire rising into the sky, the ultimate weapon. Yet strangely, even this did not erase the old fear, because nuclear war meant mutual destruction. But Patton's war would not have been nuclear. It would have been decisive, fast, conventional, winnable. That was what Stalin had truly feared. The idea that the Soviet Union could be defeated without destroying the world. As decades passed, Europe remained divided. Families were separated, cities were split. Soldiers lived in trenches in peacetime, all because one general had dared to say the quiet part out loud, that the Soviets were not friends. They were the next enemy. Every time a crisis erupted, Berlin, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the memory returned. What if Patton had lived? What if he had convinced Washington? What if the Iron Curtain had never fallen? No one would ever know. But Stalin had known one thing for certain. He had survived Hitler. He had survived the Nazis, but Patton had scared him in a way no other man ever did. Because Patton didn't want to rule the world. He just wanted to win. And in war, that kind of man is the most dangerous of all.